with a mixture of pride and anxiety that occasionally tipped into superstition. It had belonged to his father, a broad-shouldered man who'd worn it to job interviews, to funerals, to the one wedding he'd attended after Gerald's mother left. Gerald had taken it in at the sides when he inherited it, paid £30 to a tailor on Kirkgate who didn't say much but did excellent work. Now, 15 years later, the suit still fit, though fit was perhaps generous. It accommodated him, the way an old house accommodates a family that has changed. He was pressing it on a Tuesday evening in October, using the damp cloth method his father had taught him, when his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. He ignored it. The iron needed his full attention, the lapels were tricky, prone to a crease that appeared exactly where it shouldn't. Steam rose in small clouds and dissipated against the kitchen window, where the glass had begun to fog with the onset of autumn. The phone buzzed again. It was his sister, Carol, texting to ask if he'd heard back yet. He hadn't. The interview was tomorrow. He put the phone face down and returned to the suit. The job was with a logistics company based in the city centre, not glamorous, not what he'd once imagined for himself, but solid. The listing had described it as a senior operations coordinator role, and the salary was enough that Gerald had read the figure twice, then a third time, then closed his laptop and sat very still for a moment. He'd been out of steady work for 14 months. He'd done some freelance work during that time, inventory consulting for a small firm in Morley, a short contract that ended when the firm itself ended. But nothing permanent, nothing with a pension contribution and a staff parking space and the feeling of somewhere to be in the morning. He hung the suit on the back of the bedroom door and stood looking at it for a moment. In the dim light of the hallway it looked almost like a person, a thinner, more confident version of himself, waiting patiently. Get some sleep, he told himself. He didn't. He was up at 5:30. This was not unusual. Insomnia had been a companion of his for years, the kind of companion you stop fighting and simply accommodate, offering it a chair and a cup of tea and hoping it leaves before morning. He made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the lights off, watching the street outside go from black to grey. A fox crossed the road at the end of the cul-de-sac, paused, looked at nothing, and continued into the darkness between two houses. Gerald had written his cover letter 4 times. The first version had been honest to the point of strangeness. He'd actually written, in the second paragraph, "I am not naturally enthusiastic, but I am reliable, which I have come to believe is more valuable." He'd stared at it for a long time before deleting it. The second version was too formal, stiff as cardboard. The third had a joke in it that he'd removed in the fourth, which was the one he'd sent. It said all the right things about dynamic environments and cross-functional collaboration and a passion for operational excellence, and he believed, writing it, perhaps 40% of it. The 40% that was true was this: he was good at the work. He had always been good at the work. He could look at a logistical problem for supply chain, a scheduling conflict, a warehouse flow, and see the solution the way some people claim to see shapes in clouds, immediately and without effort. It was not a glamorous talent. It did not win him admiration at parties, on the rare occasions he attended them. But it was real, and it was his, and he was tired of apologizing for the fact that it wasn't more. He showered. He dressed carefully, taking longer than necessary with the tie, a dark navy one, his only tie that wasn't somehow wrong. He looked at himself in the mirror. He was 43 years old. His hair had gone grey at the temples in a way that Carol called distinguished and that he suspected was just grey. His face was the face of a man who had worked hard and slept inconsistently and laughed at the right moments without always feeling the laugh. He was not unpleasant looking. He was not remarkable looking. He was the kind of man who could stand in a room and be noticed by no one, which had its disadvantages and its occasional, unexpected uses. "You're good at the work," he said to the mirror. The man in the mirror looked like he was considering it. He left the house 40 minutes early. Just in case. The bus was half empty. Gerald sat near the middle, his folder on his lap, and watched Leeds wake up outside the window. The city had a particular quality in early morning that he'd always liked, provisional, unhurried, like a stage being set before anyone's arrived to watch. Delivery vans idled outside bakeries. A woman in a yellow jacket walked a dog the size of a small ottoman. The bus passed the street where he'd worked for 11 years before the redundancy, and he looked at the building the way you look at an ex-partner's house when you drive past it, briefly, deliberately, without expression. The folder contained his CV. 2 pages, which he'd agonized over, not because there wasn't enough to fill more but because he'd been told 2 pages was what they wanted, and he was a man who gave people what they asked for. It also contained 2 references, both solid, both written by people who meant what they said. And it contained something he hadn't been asked to bring, a single page he'd written about himself, not a CV supplement exactly, more of a, he wasn't sure what to call it. A clarification. It described, in plain language, how he worked, what he was like to work with, what he needed to do well, and what he was honestly not suited for. He'd written it at 2 in the morning 3 nights ago, when the insomnia was particularly active, and in the morning he'd nearly removed it from the folder. Then he'd nearly removed it again as he left the house. It was still there. He wasn't sure why. The company was called Harlow Logistics, and its offices occupied the 4th and 5th floors of a glass building near the station that Gerald had walked past 100 times without ever wondering what was inside. The lobby had a receptionist's desk made of pale wood, a waiting area with chairs that were more stylish than comfortable, and a plant, a large monstera in a terracotta pot, that was thriving with a vigor that felt almost pointed. Someone had been watering it for years. It had responded by becoming extraordinary. Gerald gave his name to the receptionist, a young man who wore his competence lightly and had clearly already had a productive morning. He was shown to the waiting area. Saturday. There were 4 other candidates. He counted them without meaning to, the way you count stairs. 2 women and 2 men, all younger than him, all holding folders. One of the women was making small, controlled notes on a legal pad. One of the men was reading the company brochure with an expression of intense concentration that Gerald recognized as performance. He'd done it himself, in other waiting rooms, in other decades. The remaining woman was simply sitting, looking at her hands, and Gerald liked her immediately for it. He looked at the monstera. He thought about whoever watered it. Not the current receptionist, he decided, someone before, someone who'd committed to a relationship with a plant that could give nothing back, and had done it anyway, consistently, until the thing was magnificent. There was something in that he wanted to think about more carefully, but his name was called and the thought dissolved. The interview room was on the 5th floor, and it had a view of the city that Gerald would have liked to look at for longer than was appropriate. He sat down across from 2 interviews, a woman in her mid-50s named Patricia, who had the calm authority of someone who had seen many things and been surprised by few of them, and a younger man named Dhruv, who had a notepad and a pen and wrote in it at intervals that Gerald couldn't predict. They began with the standard questions, and Gerald answered them the way he'd practiced, clearly, without excess. Where did he see himself in 5 years? He talked about development, about embedding himself in a team, about understanding the specific operational challenges of the company rather than imposing solutions from outside. What was his greatest professional achievement? He described a scheduling restructure he'd overseen at his previous company that had reduced delivery delays by 22%. He remembered the exact figure because he'd been proud of it, genuinely, in the unperformed way that he was proud of very few things. What were his weaknesses? He said he sometimes found it difficult to delegate work he could see how to do himself, and that he'd spent years learning to trust the people around him rather than absorbing tasks that should belong to someone else. It was true, and he said it without the apologetic register that made weakness questions usually so painful to listen to. Patricia asked him to describe his management style. He talked about clarity. Being clear about what was needed, and why, and when, and then letting people work. He said he didn't believe in managing through anxiety, creating urgency where it didn't exist. He said that in his experience, the teams that worked best were the ones that trusted each other to do their jobs without constant supervision, and that his role in that was to remove obstacles rather than add them. Dhruv wrote something. Gerald looked at the wall. Then Patricia said, "You've had a gap in your employment. 14 months. Can you talk about that?" He'd prepared for this. He knew the answer he was supposed to give, and he began to give it. I used the time to reassess, to consult on a freelance basis, to ensure my next role was the right fit rather than simply the nearest available, and it was all true, but partway through he stopped. He stopped because it was true but incomplete, and he was tired of incomplete truths presented in the packaging of complete ones. Partly that, he said. But I'll be honest with you, the first few months were difficult. I'd been in the same place for 11 years, and when it ended, I didn't know quite who I was outside of it. I think I underestimated how much of my sense of purpose, I suppose, came from having somewhere to go in the morning that needed what I had. He paused. I wasn't unwell or anything dramatic like that. I was just quieter than usual for a while. And then I stopped being quiet, and I started working again, and I remembered that I'm good at this, and I missed it. That's the honest version. Patricia looked at him. Drew's pen was still. Thank you, Patricia said, and Gerald couldn't tell if she meant it the way people mean thank you for being honest or the way they mean thank you, that's enough of that. He suspected the former, but he'd been wrong before. Near the end of the interview, Drew asked a question that Gerald hadn't prepared for, which was unusual. He'd prepared, he had thought, for most things. If you could redesign one aspect of a typical logistics operation from scratch, Drew said, what would it be, and why? Gerald was quiet for a moment. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because there were several answers and he was choosing between them with the speed and care of a man sorting through a box in the dark. Communication between the floor and the coordination team, he said. In almost every operation I've worked in or consulted for, there's a disconnect. People on the ground have information that doesn't make it upward in time, and decisions get made at the coordination level that ignore what's actually happening. The fix isn't always technological. Sometimes it's just giving people a clear, low-friction way to flag what they're seeing before it becomes a problem. The fanciest logistics software I've ever used was in a warehouse that had a catastrophic delivery failure because no one told the coordinator that one of the loading bay doors had been out of commission for 2 days. He paused. The door had a workaround, but the workaround took 40% longer. Nobody communicated it upward. It wasn't negligence, the team on the floor assumed someone knew. The coordinator assumed the floor would flag any significant issues. Both assumptions were reasonable. Both were wrong. Drew wrote something longer this time. Patricia said, what would you have done? A 10-minute end-of-shift flag system, Gerald said. Nothing elaborate. A structured 3 questions that take 5 minutes to answer, submitted by the floor supervisor at the end of each shift. What worked, what didn't, what needs attention before the next shift starts. Reviewed by coordination within the hour. Simple as that. He looked at her. The solution is almost never as complicated as people want it to be. They shook hands at the door. Patricia told him they'd be in touch within the week. Drew thanked him for coming in. In the lift on the way down, Gerald stood alone with his reflection in the metal doors, distorted, elongated, slightly unfamiliar. And exhaled for what felt like the first time since morning. He thought about the folder and the page he hadn't been asked to bring. He'd not taken it out. He wasn't sure now why he'd written it or why he'd kept it in. Perhaps because it felt important to have it there, not to show anyone, just to have it, to carry proof that he knew who he was clearly enough to write it down. Some things you brought to a room not to hand over, but to remind yourself. He walked to the park rather than catching the bus directly home. It was a cold, bright afternoon, the kind of October day that apologizes for nothing, and the park was nearly empty, a woman pushing a pram along the path, 2 old men on a bench with a distance between them that suggested years of comfortable silence. Gerald sat on a bench of his own and put his folder beside him and looked at the trees, which were in that transitional state between green and gold where they were briefly both things at once. He thought about the interview. He thought about the moment he'd stopped giving the prepared answer and given the honest one, and whether that had been courage or recklessness or simply tiredness wearing the costume of courage. He didn't know. He thought he'd said true things, mostly. He thought he'd been in the room, something close to the person he actually was, rather than an optimized version of that person constructed for the purpose of being hired. Whether that was a strategy or a liability depended on Patricia and Drew and whatever Drew had written in the notepad, and he would not know for a week. Carol called while he was sitting there. He answered. "How did it go?" she asked. "I don't know," he said. "All right, I think. Possibly all right." "Were you nervous?" "Yes. But not more than it warranted." She laughed at that. Carol laughed the way their mother had laughed, which was one of the better things about Carol. "Did you wear the suit?" "I did." "And?" "It held up," he said. "We both did." He could hear her smiling through the phone. She asked if he wanted to come for dinner on Sunday, and he said yes, and they talked for a few more minutes about nothing important. Her kids, a television program they'd both been watching, a problem with her boiler that had turned out to be simple. When he hung up, the park was quieter, and the light had shifted, and the trees had gone from gold back to something more ordinary, or perhaps his eyes had simply adjusted. He picked up his folder and walked to the bus stop. The letter arrived on Friday, which was 3 days earlier than Patricia had said, which Gerald spent several minutes trying not to interpret as a sign of anything. He sat with it on the kitchen table, still sealed, for slightly longer than was rational. The morning was grey and close, rain beginning against the window in the tentative way October rain begins, as if unsure of its welcome. He opened it. It was 3 paragraphs. The first was formal. Thanking him for attending, noting the high caliber of candidates, which Gerald translated as, "There were other people, and we considered them." The second paragraph contained the word "pleased." The third contained a start date. He read it again. Then a third time. He put it down on the table and looked at it. The rain had committed itself now, proper rain, steady and indifferent. He made a second cup of coffee he didn't strictly need and stood at the window with it, looking at the street. A woman hurried past with an umbrella. A car moved slowly through a puddle that hadn't been there yesterday. The cul-de-sac was ordinary and quiet and entirely itself. Gerald thought about 14 months. About the first months, when he'd been quieter than usual. About the freelance work that had reminded him, gradually, that the talent hadn't gone anywhere just because the position had. About the suit, and the iron, and the steam. About the monster on the reception desk and the person who'd watered it without expectation until it became something extraordinary. He thought, I have somewhere to be in the morning. He texted Carol. 3 words, I got it. Her reply came in seconds, which told him she'd been waiting. It was 7 exclamation marks and a string of emojis that he couldn't fully interpret but understood completely. He finished his coffee. He washed the cup, dried it, put it back in the cupboard. He went to the bedroom and looked at the suit, still hanging on the back of the door where he'd put it Wednesday evening, waiting again. Good job, he said, to the suit or to himself, he wasn't entirely sure which, and decided it didn't matter much. They'd both earned it.